London newsagents.
Well, Ian Hislop is joining us in the newsagent's bunker right now. He's got his massive tea that he's just brought into the studio from Soho, and we're ready to go to talk about Have I Got News For You, which you've just told me is now on its 67th series.
Yes, we did the initial series in 1990.
Yes.
When Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister. So it does feel like quite a long time ago. Though, obviously, the Labour Party now, it's their heroine, so
yes, well, that's true.
It's a new Thatcherite era coming up.
I mean, Series 67, it's an extraordinary long time, right? I mean, not as long as you've been editor of Private Eye, of course, which we'll talk about. But you when you get jobs,
suggesting
no.
I get stuck in jobs?
I think Series 67, you've barely started. You know? I always find that when a series gets to its into its 70th series, that's when things really start to peak or into its zenith. But what are you? I mean, it's certainly true to say that once you get into a job, you like it, you stick to it.
Yes, it's either that I really enjoy it or I'm very, very desperate and I think I'll never get employed anywhere else. So take your pick.
How's it changed over time? I mean, you've already alluded to it, right? I mean, it's seen every Prime Minister since Thatcher. You've satirised them all. You've talked about them all week after week with Paul Merton and latterly an endless sort of array of hosts as well. Has the show changed? Has the task of it for you changed?
No, it seems to be more or less identical.
Really?
The news changes and then you look at old series and you think, oh no, the whole of round one was about the NHS, the whole of round two was about the US presidential election. It hasn't changed that much. So the news is very cyclical, and I don't mean there's a news cycle. I mean it comes around again and again. And so that surprises me. But essentially, I mean, there are two things going on. I mean, one is that it's a sitcom about class between Paul Merton and myself.
Oh, yeah, yes.
The news is a vehicle to discuss that. And then you have fortunately, these other people who liven the show up.
Do you think that, I mean, that is a sort of theme of it, isn't it, over the years in a way? I mean, that is the sort of just something that you and he have back and forth gone through over the decades.
Yes.
Sort of take the piss of each other in terms of your different class backgrounds.
Yes, and I think he still finds it irritating.
Do you get on?
Yeah, we do get on. I mean,
it's a long time to have spent with each other.
Yes, and it would be a long time not to get on. I think slowly over the years he's forgiven me. I think in the early days he was quite cross. That I was a toffee-nosed twat, and that he had left school and hadn't gone to university. And interestingly, over the years, certainly when we started, I would claim to have been better read and more culturally informed than Paul. But as the years have gone by, I would say now I'm probably not. And that I keep being picked up by him. So, no, I have to watch myself nowadays.
But has it not changed, and I suppose this relates to your work as editor of Private Eye as well, in terms of satirising politicians? Because on the face of it, it would seem that the politicians have become more outrageous.
Yes.
Harder to satirise in the sense that, if you look at Trump or Johnson or whatever, that they're different, surely, to the sort of politicians that you started with when you were talking about Major and Thatcher and even Blair, right?
Again, people say this, but I would say not. I mean, I remember President Reagan, people said, you can't possibly satirise this man. He falls asleep during defence meetings. He's
a ridiculous character.
B-movie acty absurd. And I talked to my colleagues at Private Eye who were there in the 60s. I mean, I started in the 80s. I say, well, in your day, people were much more sensible and serious. And they say, you've got to be kidding. I mean, when the Transport Minister was building motorways and cutting trains because he owned most of the cement and ran the construction business, you can't say, well, it's never been corrupt like now. It has. And the job is to try and point this out.
Is there a politician, either for Have I Got News For You, or particularly, I suppose, for Private Eye, a Prime Minister or politician, that you did find it harder to satirise, at least to sort of get a handle on? Because you've got to kind of get a grip into them in some way, haven't you? You've got to kind of find their weakness. Would it be Blair? I don't know. Who might it have been?
Again, I think people imagine when they come in, because we don't know people very well, and this is partly deliberate, until this recent biography, I think people knew very, very little about Keir Starmer. And pretending you're boring is part of a politician's trick. If you remember John Major, the initial joke was, well, John Major's very boring. After a bit, you have to come up with something else. And it turned out that John Major wasn't quite so boring, and those 7 years were quite long. And quite a lot was achieved during them. And again, if people are caricatures of themselves, you know, Trump and Johnson, it's easier for a satirist.
Because people often say that, you know, someone like Trump or Johnson, they have no shame. Or Truss, maybe. They have no shame. So it's hard, in order to, certainly, I mean, journalistically, in a sort of more traditional journalistic format, obviously, if you're interviewing someone, it is harder to interview someone if they have no shame, because you say to them, but what about this you said? Or what about this you did? And they just say, well, I did it. Or I said it, Yes,
and you lie, and it I mean, it's particularly hard on television and in radio because you don't get long enough. You always have to say, well, thank you very much, that's enough now. Easier in print, because you don't have to stop. You can just repeat it every fortnight forever. But that assumes that the only mechanism is to say you said one thing, then you said another. Trump doesn't mind that. Boris, quite literally, you would show him a clip of himself in Parliament and say, did you say that? And he'd say no. And the clip is literally in front of him. So, I mean, that is a problem. But you have to find other ways to get under their skin. And the Americans have been very good with Trump, realising that he didn't care about sex. He's just uninterested in policy. He is interested in money.
And gets embarrassed about money. And,
and the suggestion that he's not a brilliant businessman really hurts. And you can see him going absolutely nuts.
Well, indeed, he's having to pay $400 million basically for precisely that reason, right? Exactly. Because he exaggerated his wealth and his business.
And the same with Johnson, who, you know, was a buffoon, but the mask of finding everything funny dropped pretty swiftly once you went into the realms of your competence, your supposed cleverness, your ability to do this job is actually nil. That's when it started kicking in.
I mean, obviously, Boris Johnson himself, I mean, he was in so many ways, you know, made his name on your show, on Have I Got News For You, at least in terms of public consciousness. When he was doing that, and those clips have become famous, and people who weren't around at the time, they watched them on YouTube and so on, he was, in his own way, very good at it.
Well, he was very bad at it, and I think
that was what made him good at it.
Yes. I mean, I remember feeling very clearly this person can't even run a quiz show. The idea that he would be mayor was just a mile away.
Which people sort of forget now. I mean, even that seemed sort of absurd at the time. Yeah.
And the idea that he would be an MP seemed very likely. And do you remember he lied and said, I won't be an MP and editor of The Spectator. And then, of course...
But he promised his proprietor that, of course, famously.
And then he did. So, I mean, it is extraordinary that anybody took him at his own estimation. But remember, I mean, he was on Newsnight most nights, and when Jeremy Paxman retired, the two of them did a sort of bromantic cycle about on a tandem. So he'd become, you know, when he was playing centrist One Nation Tory before he joined the Brexiteers, he had decided to pitch himself as lovable liberal.
But when you were sat there and you were recording those shows with him, I mean, were you sat there thinking, look, this is entirely calculated, I know exactly what he's doing, he knows exactly what he's doing, or do you think it was genuinely sort of completely buffoonish?
Yeah, I think he's instinctively an idiot. And then he overlays that with a certain amount of cunning. But the first time he appeared on the show, he was absolutely furious. He wrote a piece in the Telegraph afterwards saying the entire thing's scripted, and the entire show was designed to trap me into talking about the Darius Guppy tape, which again,
which you confronted him about on the show, because that was when he was a guest. Yes,
and I mean, it wouldn't have taken, you know, a Nostradamus to guess that I might bring this tape up. Now, Boris Johnson was a journalist at the time, and to suggest that someone making perfectly legitimate inquiries into a fraudulent businessman should be beaten up seemed to me pretty scandalous. It still does. He is, and I find myself shocked again in retrospect. He is completely outrageous in his lack of any public morality. He has an intense and incredibly bogus, I think, personal morality, which he demonstrated during the Guppy years and subsequently.
But it is interesting, isn't it? Because if we take Trump and Johnson,
yes,
they both, in very different ways, but they both used entertainment television, media, to legitimise themselves, to put themselves in front of the public, to become well known, to end up achieving the kind of highest office. I mean, did you And obviously there were so many other things at play, and I'm not saying that your show was responsible for
Yeah.
Boris Johnson, but you must have thought about those shows. Did you ever feel any sense of responsibility for him, in a sense? Maybe that's the wrong word, but...
No, because I didn't vote for him, and in the end, an entertainment show invites people on who the producers want to invite on. And we were first accused of, because the person who was on more often than Boris was Ken Livingstone. And in the show's first sort of 5 or 6 years, it was accused basically of turning Red Ken into a lovable, funny national institution from which he stayed as mayor. And then Charles Kennedy was on, the very popular Liberal, who was known as Chat Show Charlie, you remember, because the Liberal Party objected to him going on television. So I don't think you can have a blanket ban on television for people who people might like.
No, but I suppose the argument is more that in treating politicians as kind of figures of fun, it humanises
He wasn't a
them.
politician at the time. I don't know how many times I have to repeat
Well,
this.
but he was surely he was invited on later when he was a politician. Was an
No,
MP.
he was originally invited on before he became mayor as a supposedly amusing journalist and figure of fun.
Yes, but I suppose the argument is, generally speaking, that
Yes.
with politicians, that in sort of making them figures of fun or humanising them in this way and allowing them to, although as you say, you held him to account in a sense on that show, that in some ways that it treats them differently from normal politicians and they use it to their advantage.
They certainly do try and use it to their advantage, but they do the same with breakfast TV or podcasts or any other format that's going. They will be on and they will tell you about themselves. They'll tell you about the dishwasher, which isn't strictly important for policy.
No,
or they
probably
will attempt to take part in formats that are not entirely political, but they then say are necessary in order to engage with the public.
One development of recent years is that there are more and more politicians who actually try and reverse what you do, what all journalists do, what I do, which is to say that actually the problem is not them, it's not the politician or their failing.
Yes.
It's you, it's us, it's journalists, because we are part of an elite, whatever it is, and that they are themselves, in fact, representing the public in a way that we can never do.
Yeah.
Has that changed the game at all in terms of satire? Is that something you're conscious of and think about?
Again, I think satirically it's very useful because it's always terribly funny. I mean, the presentation of outsiders, if you want to take Trump, he's a sort of New York playboy from an unbelievably rich family.
Or Liz Truss this week. She's described herself as the only conservative in the room at any given moment, at any given time, always fighting for true conservative values.
Yes.
Within the deep state, even though, of course, she herself had been an MP for 14 years.
Yes, and, Boris Johnson saying, I'm the sort of person you'd like to go down the pub with. What, an old Etonian who was at Oxford, was from, a very elite family, who made his brother a lord.
But they get away with it.
Yes, and it seems to me extraordinary that Nigel Farage, lovely prep school boy, went into the city. Outsider? Working class hero? Oh, come on. These are bogus representations of the self.
But in a way, then, in a sort of, let's say, broadly, talk about it broadly, the journalistic world, we've failed, haven't we? Because in allowing them, that narrative has become very deeply embedded, and many people find it very, very hard to challenge. And these people have used it tremendously. But as you say, in one sense, it's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's genuinely ridiculous. I myself interviewed Jacob Rees-Mogg recently. I've interviewed him a few times. Quite a few times he's, suggested that I am a part of the kind of media political elite. Now, my father was a welder. His father was, as we know, the former editor of the Times, and clearly a very august member of the British establishment. But I don't know whether these people think it, or genuinely believe it or not. I think actually some of them do. But the fact that they're able to say things like that with a straight face, and actually it's become so deeply embedded.
Jacob Rees-Mogg literally says "Vox Populi, Vox Dei," attempting to convince you of his credentials
This is what I mean,
as a
Ian.
popular
It's so
voice in
absurd.
Latin.
And yet here we are. This has become a very deeply embedded part of our discourse.
Absolutely. As you say, I think you're right to say, well, we've all failed. We have to try harder. And again, even that will be taken as patronising. What do you mean you've failed? The people have seen through you.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And they've not accepted your narrative. I hope that in the coming year, the narrative will change. And there will be a feeling that perhaps this version of what the people want is not what they want.
Do you think, in a way, I mean, one of the themes of what we're talking about, really, isn't it, is kind of the weakness of journalism and to some extent satire. I mean, I was
that's
thinking,
what you're talking
well,
about.
That's what
I'm not.
talking about. Well, okay. Well, it feels like that is at least something it's something that we've been talking about quite a lot in recent years.
I think again, if you're talking about the failure of satire, you just have to remember Peter Cook once memorably saying, "I mean, satire at its peak in the cabaret scene in Berlin. They certainly stopped Hitler."
No, but that's
oh no, they didn't.
Well,
and Jonathan Swift, the greatest English
in a way,
satirist, people saying, "Well, what did he ever achieve?"
Yes,
I mean, again, I think people who say, well, satire has failed because something is happening which I don't like, that may not be the entire story.
Indeed. Well, that's what I was going to ask you, is whether precisely that, whether you think that, in a way, if we're expecting satire to achieve something,
yes,
or to affect a political change or political end or political objective, whether that's looking at it the wrong way, whether actually it's just there to give us a bit of a laugh along the way. And that's
I would say
it
is part of the democratic process, but it's not the entire democratic process. And people say, have you toppled the government? And you say, well, no, that's your job as the voter.
We attach too much
I think
importance to it in a way.
Simplifies the job, which is to crystallise an opinion using humour, to put the comic point succinctly, and that's where you stop. I mean, that is what you're meant to do, and that's meant to make people laugh and help in that sense. But it is, I would say, an important part of the process. It's all well saying it's as important as to make people laugh as it is to make them vote. But it is both of those things matter. And I think to say, well, Trump's in office, satire's failed, that's not maybe all the story.
Well, it's certainly not the only thing that's failed, right?
Yeah.
Or indeed the most important thing that's failed. Even on a kind of micro level, I suppose, what I'm thinking about is, I mean, you've been involved on Have I Got News For You on some, I think in the modern parlance you might say, memorable takedowns, right? Some
attempts, yes.
Yeah, and perhaps the most famous one that I always think of anyway is what you said to Piers Morgan. No love lost between you and Piers. I think it's fair to say.
That would certainly be fair to say.
That's fair to say. And I mean, you destroyed him really on that show.
Yes.
Of course, we know what happened next with Piers.
Yeah, he became
it wasn't
more rich and more
completely
famous, and nothing stopped him. But I gather he's now gone online, which is one of those great euphemisms. Which means we're not going to see him for a bit. Is that right?
Well, it's not entirely clear. He never goes away for long, of course. I think it's fair to say. What do you make? I mean, obviously, in terms of TV news and the development of TV journalism, we have had these new channels, GB News,
yes,
Talk TV, RIP. What do you make of them? Do you watch them much? Have you good fodder for the show occasionally?
Yes, I mean, I think they're much clipped, and I think the truth about them is that almost nobody watches them except other journalists who then
get very angry about them,
or think they're funny, or replay them, and then they get a huge amount of coverage that way. And there's clearly a core audience. The last taxi I got in, the taxi driver said, "Are you going to watch GB News, the big interview tonight?" And I said, "I'm terribly sorry, I don't know who's on."
Who was on? Did you find out?
I believe it's the Prime Minister.
Oh right, okay, fine. Yeah.
Again, who's going for the tough crowd? As
interviewed by Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Probably.
Yeah.
Or I mean, there are a lot of Tory MPs to choose from, presenters, so it could be any of them.
I mean, but on the, I mean, as you say, Piers is going online. I mean, that clip. I mean, when you actually watch it back, it's pretty extraordinary because at one point he does sort of threaten to send a photographer around to your house.
Yes, and I mean, he did actually do that.
He did?
Yeah, I mean, later on, that Piers ran a huge campaign. There were full-page ads in the Mirror saying, "Have you got any dirt on Ian Hislop?" He offered money. He rang up everybody I'd ever known on. It was called Friends Reunited then, and he put journalists outside my house. I mean, they were in my village. So every time I did the school run...
To what end? I mean, what were they hoping they'd see?
It was straight.
Just intimidating?
It was straightforward harassment, really. I mean, the Eye had run a number of stories about Piers, and one was about the share tipping scandal, and there were others. And he, as a journalist, he doesn't like other people taking an interest in him. And so he went full on, and he said he had a secret dossier that he was going to print. And I mean, as ever, it just got very, very funny. I mean, my vicar in Kent, very delightful, man rang up and said, I've had the Daily Mirror on the phone. They want to know if you've confessed anything juicy.
Had you?
And I mean, I had to point out it's Church of England.
Yes.
We do a general confession. We don't do individual confession. I'm not a Catholic. So there's a certain amount of theological problems there with the Mirror. But B, the vicar, very charmingly, said, obviously, I don't want to break any confidence. But, there was a photographer there every time I came out my gate. He took a picture of me every morning. And I said, what do you want? And he said, I want a picture of you looking really happy so that we can put it in the paper with some event, some disaster that's happened. So it looks like you're immensely callous. So I said, and I said, okay, well, that's quite cynical. But on the whole, I'll just not help. And then the car he was using got a puncture and I laughed. So there was a picture of me looking happy.
And now he's the most famous British journalist in the world.
Absolutely, and a friend of Trump on whichever day it is. He is rather like Boris. They don't have any fixed views as far as I can see. It's just whichever is the most effective way to move on.
I mean, obviously, it's not just domestically or nationally that sometimes I suppose things feel a bit dark to joke about, and it can be hard to do so. Obviously, internationally, at the moment, things feel darker than they have done for many decades. Dealing with Gaza, talking about it on shows like Have I Got News for You, Private Eye. I mean, how easy or difficult is that?
I mean, that is difficult because there is a sort of, oh, my goodness, you're not going to mention that factor. I suggested on the last series that there should be a ceasefire, which, again, if you cast your mind back, that was considered deeply revolutionary as opposed to being actually American foreign policy and something they put through the UN. It is tragedy plus time equals comedy, as usual. And the Private Eye cover about Gaza was the most complained about cover, which was now looks more and more like a statement of fact.
Just remind people what it says.
It was the suggestion on the cover. We put a warning on that this magazine may contain some criticism of Israel, and we were trying to suggest that killing everybody in Gaza was not a helpful solution to the problems of the region.
And you had more complaints about that
from anything we've done since the Diana cover. And it was extraordinary. And again, the intent, the satirical intent of the joke was pretty clear. And I think now it reads as quite bland. But at the time, it was one of those things people didn't want to hear.
It is also often said, of course, that you have the distinction of being the most sued man in British legal history, something which I assume you're quite proud of in its own way. I don't know if you've seen the news from Scotland around changes to proposed hate crime laws, indeed, not just proposed at this point, it is indeed an act. As journalists, we know, something we often talk about on the show, I think people are not aware just how many limits actually there are on free speech in the UK, particularly with regard to libel and defamation. Which can make it quite hard to do journalism, as we know, and obviously the hate crime laws are different to that. But what's your assessment of them?
Well, I mean, the Scottish bill in particular, I think, is very worrying for a number of reasons. I mean, largely because it's very badly phrased, and the people who've come up with the laws have ended up saying, well, I think it's up to Police Scotland to work out what it means, and that isn't what lawmakers are meant to do.
You've had 2 hours training.
Yeah, you are meant to create the law, and the police are meant to enforce it. And Scotland, which has had a very bad reputation in the last few years about the proximity of the police service to the political establishment, and the idea that the police will therefore be deciding what you can and can't say, seems to me very unhealthy. I mean, I gave evidence at the Leveson inquiry about the unhealthy proximity between the British police and various media organisations and various politicians during that era, and I stick to that. This is not how it should be done. There are other problems with the bill, but it is unclear. Someone asked, does this apply to journalists? Does it apply to comedians? Does it apply to satirists? And there were 2 replies. One is no, of course not, and well, it's up to the police.
Going back to Have I Got News for You before we finish Series 67. Rishi Sunak is obviously going to be a big part of this series. Perhaps.
I thought you said he's coming on as a guest.
God, that would be bad, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, if it springs a quick election.
Oh, he'll be in Pasadena. He won't see him for us. What do you make of him as Prime Minister? How much material do you think he's going to be able to provide for the show?
Again, he came in, as people do, people saying, well, he's very boring, and he's just a tech bro, and there's no humour there. And then he turned out to be incredibly funny because he's incredibly bad at politics in a way that very few people guessed. And post-Truss, I think there was this enormous relief that said, at least someone sensible has arrived. And then he's not very sensible. And he is quite bizarre. I mean, I think the attempts to pass himself off as a man of the people, which is this thing you're meant to do before you get elected.
Hard with Rishi, isn't it? I mean, tricky.
It is tricky. The dishwasher moment, again.
Petrol moments,
terrific. Helicopter moments,
the Mexican Coke moments.
I mean, they are all terrific, and I think this is a media strategy, isn't it? They don't want to let him out, so they do funny little videos.
Tricky in an election, of course.
It is a bit tricky.
Do you think he's worse than Truss?
I think it's about on a par. I mean, certainly the polls, and if you're a Conservative, I mean, you would be thinking, we thought we would get someone who couldn't do worse, and then you do. But I don't know, sacking Lee Anderson and then replacing him with another man who's a bit like Lee Anderson. I mean, all of these mistakes he just makes endlessly.
Finally, I mean, you, as a private eye, have I got news for you? You spent, the best part of 4 decades satirising the British establishment.
Yeah. And they're still there.
And they don't change. As you say, it's sort of cyclical.
How extraordinary is that?
How extraordinary is that, yeah.
The idea
thing's got deep roots.
That human nature might be a constant. Oh!
Yeah. It's a bit dispiriting, I suppose, but we'll all have to sort of plough our way through it. Do you consider yourself a cynical person?
No.
Do you retain much optimism about politics? Is it possible? Is that easy to do?
Yes, and I always say I am not cynical, I'm sceptical, which is entirely different.
Yes.
And it allows you to have some basis for hope. And I do believe that it's worth doing journalism and doing satire because it might be a lot worse if you didn't. I think that's...
As your private eyes work on the post office scandal recently.
Well, yes, there are moments where you think that was worth it. And there are stories we've followed for decades and they turn out okay. And there are moments of hope and justice prevails and it's not all bleak. And that seems to me, if not a very high bar, but it's one to aim for.
You said my 30 years of having a look at how things go badly hasn't totally inured me to the possibility they could go well. Do you think they still might go well?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I don't give up. And if I did, I would never have done any of it. I mean, there are political humour and doing satire. There are other fields of humour which are less hard work.
Well, I'm looking forward to series 167. And we can come back and discuss whether anything in the British establishment has changed at that time.
Yeah, but you'll be older, so that'll be good.
Okay, fine. Ian Hislop, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.